Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. This week, it's all about corporate corruption. First, we'll be taking a look at the concept of failing upwards, where corporate CEOs are rewarded with millions of dollars for driving companies into bankruptcy, while the American taxpayers are forced to bail them out. Then, we'll be taking a look at a special feature from Mike Papantonio and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about the history of corporate fraud and the whistleblowers who are helping to hold some of the biggest corporations in America accountable for their crimes. That's all coming up, but right now, you've just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
American workers across almost all sectors of the economy are struggling. Over the last few years, worker productivity has risen by almost 17%, yet wages for nearly 70% of our labor force have remained stagnant for about 8 years. The remaining 30% of American workers have only seen their paychecks increase by about 3% in that same time. Workers are giving their all and getting less in return. But up on that top rung of the corporate ladder, CEOs have never had it better. Even when we had banks and brokerage houses going bust, their chief executives were rewarded with multi-billion-dollar paydays, while the American taxpayers had to keep their businesses above water. Just like former President George W. Bush, these corporate leaders managed to continuously fail upwards, leaving a trail of ruin in their wake. Joining me now to discuss the gross disparity between hard-working Americans and inept corporate leaders is Zoe Carpenter, a reporter from The Nation magazine's Washington bureau. So Zoe, we do have these American CEOs out there who are driving corporations into the ground, pulling in these massive multi-million-dollar paydays at the end of every year. And I think one of the most obvious cases, one of the most notable ones, is Richard Fuld over at Lehman Brothers. Tell us the Richard Fuld story.
Sure. So Richard Fuld ran Lehman Brothers, I believe, since 1994 until its collapse during the financial crisis. And in the 8 years leading up to the financial crisis, he consecutively made that list of the top 25 highest paid chief executives. And so he was raking in the money. Meanwhile, the bank that he was running was making a series of bad investments and then covering them up with accounting tricks, and ended up, collapsing. And that was one of the events that defined the financial crash. And all told, he took in about $466 million over those 8 years leading up to the crash.
And the whole board knew about these accounting tricks. I mean, this wasn't something that Fuld himself was doing. Everybody on that top rung of the corporate ladder there was aware of what was going on, and instead of doing something, they rewarded him for making it look like they were being very successful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that level of cover-up went through the whole organization. It wasn't just him, but he was very well compensated for helping run that firm to the ground. This is not, unfortunately, just a few examples. This has become a growing trend in America, correct? That is correct. So this new report from the Institute for Policy Studies looked at that top 25 list over 20 years, and they found that nearly 40% of all of our highest paid chief executives either ran their firm into bankruptcy or towards government bailouts, or paid fraud-related settlements or fines, or were forced they were terminated against their will. So none of those are things that we would characterize as good performance or performance that warrants millions of dollars in compensation.
I had mentioned earlier in the intro is that, this is kind of the same mentality that gave America George W. Bush. The man had failed in every endeavor he had gone through in his life, and somehow still managed to continue to climb up and up and up. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of these CEOs these days. And so, when you've got this gross income inequality in America, what does this do when we're giving people millions of dollars for being terrible at their jobs? I mean, how does that affect this income inequality and even, worker, mentality?
Well, it affects inequality in a lot of ways. I mean, one is the direct repercussions of the financial crisis. We're still feeling that. especially in working and middle-class families. Meanwhile, the pay has gone straight back up for CEOs. We're back at record levels for executive compensation. So we're seeing inequality widen. And there are these tax loopholes that are increasing that inequality as well. So there are a lot of ways in which it's not just that we're paying CEOs for poor performance, it's that we're paying them for poor performance, and then taxpayers are having to pick up the slack, and that's increasing inequality.
Right, and well, that's a very important point, is that taxpayers are subsidizing this. You know, we're picking up part of that tab. And so is there anything at all being done in Washington to maybe put a stop to this?
Yep, there are some bills looking at closing those tax loopholes. One of the big tax loopholes is that companies are allowed to deduct performance-based executive compensation, and that's different from a regular salary. Usually those are stock options, but those can be worth millions of dollars. And so there's actually an incentive in the tax code for companies to increase that, to increase those performance-based packages. And so there are bills in Congress to close that loophole and limit all of the deductions that a company can take for executive compensation. The other thing is we have already passed legislation in the form of the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, and that just needs to be enacted, and regulators are really dragging their feet. One of the things that is in Dodd-Frank that would help is that it would force companies to disclose the pay gap, the ratio between what their top CEOs make and what their average workers make. And that would just make the system a lot more transparent, so we could really see how much inequality there was in the system. And then it also asks regulators to figure out how to control some of the performance-based pay practices that encourage excessive risk-taking that contributed to the financial collapse.
So just to kind of summarize again, we've got, you know, up to $1 million is a tax write-off, except in the case of, you know, CEO compensation, you know, anything additional than salary. That's unlimited. There's no limits on how much they can write off in their taxes for that. Am I getting that right?
Right now, that's completely unlimited. So you can have millions of dollars of stock options, and your company gets a tax break for that. So that doesn't make any sense, and that's costing the U.S. a lot of money, about $30 billion. To do those, to have those tax loopholes in there. And meanwhile, we're cutting social spending programs that people really depend on and that they really need, like food stamps. And so it doesn't really, it doesn't contribute to a healthy society when we're cutting essential social programs and then giving companies a tax breaks. We're just continuing to give away millions of dollars to people who already have millions of dollars.
Well, okay, that's a great point there. Let's talk about people who have millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and are still getting subsidies. Let's move over to the oil industry a little bit. Shifting gears a bit, I do want to talk about the Keystone XL pipeline, because recently there's been some new developments. It looks like the pipeline might be at least hopefully delayed, hopefully killed, you know, till next year. So what's happened with Keystone? What's going on with that?
So with Keystone, there has been an investigation that's been opened by the State Department's Office of the Inspector General into allegations that the contractor who was hired to do the environmental impact statement, that contractor has conflicts of interest. There have been a number of allegations that this contractor lied on their disclosure form. And so the inspector is doing this investigation and has announced that those results won't be available until January. And so that suggests that perhaps the State Department will delay its decision. We were expecting to hear a decision this fall. However, the State Department has not commented publicly about the timing of their decision.
So is this related to any of the business with Hillary Clinton? Because I know, I believe she had a few aides that had actually worked as lobbyists for TransCanada in the past. I believe Steve Horn over at DeSmogBlog was one of the people who had reported on that. Is that related to any of this, or is this a completely new development?
It's related, but different. Not related to Hillary so much. So basically, TransCanada was involved in a pipeline in Alaska that this contractor has also been involved with as recently as 2011. And on their disclosure form, the contractor, Environmental Resources Management, or ERM, certified that it did not have an existing or recent relationship with TransCanada, but they were involved in this pipeline project. And so it's not clear why that was omitted from their disclosure form, and why the State Department didn't check on their assertions, because those documents that these watchdog groups dug up were publicly available documents. And then the other potential conflict of interest, is that they have also have existing relationships with more than a dozen other companies who have a stake in the tar sands. And they also asserted on their disclosure form that they did not have any business relationships with companies that stood to profit from the approval of Keystone XL.
So it seems like this whole process, since the first days we heard the phrase Keystone XL, is just plagued with fraud. It's plagued with insiders, in the Canadian government and the U.S. government, who are, on the side of TransCanada, really working from inside the system to get this disaster of a pipeline put in place. And we've talked about it on this show many times. It will actually increase oil and gas prices in the United States. It endangers several of the country's largest aquifers, and there's going to be absolutely no safety monitoring of it. Their equipment in place couldn't even detect a pinhole leak. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that Obama is going to respond to the public pressure saying, do not go forward with this pipeline, or is he going to listen to the other side?
It's all speculative at this point. I think there is tremendous public pressure against the pipeline. I think people understand that this isn't about jobs, and it isn't about American energy independence. This is oil that's going to Asia, and it's the jobs that are going to be created are not sustainable, and they're not long-term, well-paying employment. And people are really concerned about the environment, and this has become a touchstone issue. And I think that the administration is very aware of how closely people are watching. On the other side, we have tremendous lobbying power from corporations, from the Canadian government, and so that's a big influence too. I think it is important just to mention that Keystone is not the only environmental battle out there that's worth fighting right now. There are lots of other projects that are designed to dramatically increase the scale of dirty energy production in North America. We have other pipelines. Enbridge is building pipelines throughout the Midwest. We have coal production in Wyoming and Montana, and they're trying to dramatically increase that. And that's all on federal lands. The Interior Department could shut that down too. So Keystone has become the touchstone of the climate movement, but there are these other projects that also deserve our scrutiny, because they have some of the same issues with conflicts of interest and poorly done environmental studies and things like that.
And it's difficult to fight against the amount of dirty energy money that's flowing into Washington. Right now, oil and gas combined with coal are the top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. But unfortunately, Zoe, we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll be taking a look at a mini documentary produced by Ring of Fire, where Mike Papantonio and Bobby Kennedy Jr. discuss the history of corporate fraud. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Today, we'll be taking a look at a video that Ring of Fire produced last year, where Mike Papantonio and Bobby Kennedy Jr. discuss the rampant abuse that's taking place in the federal contract system by greedy corporations. Every year, billions of dollars worth of federal contracts are awarded to corporations. These contracts run the gamut from pharmaceuticals to weapons, and it's close to impossible to find an industry taking money from the government that hasn't at least attempted to take advantage of the system. Corporations attempting to rip off the federal government is as old as the government itself. But it was during the Civil War that President Abraham Lincoln finally decided to act. After seeing how badly the government was being ripped off by contractors for things like shoes and donkeys, President Lincoln signed the False Claims Act into law that gave whistleblowers the power to come forward and expose the misdeeds of corporate America. The specific provision within that law that allows whistleblowers to bring actions against corporations on behalf of the federal government is the qui tam provision. This section of the law is what makes it so powerful. Under qui tam provisions, a whistleblower who brings an action against a corporation on behalf of the government will be entitled to a percentage of the amount recovered if fraud is proven. Between 1987 and 2008, False Claims Act lawsuits recovered about $22 billion for the federal government. And while that did amount to significant rewards for whistleblowers, it also illustrates just how badly corporations are taking advantage of both the government and United States consumers. In the year 2010 alone, the federal government recovered more than $3 billion under the False Claims Act. More than 75% of that amount was the result of whistleblower actions. Over the years, corporate America has lobbied to reduce or even completely remove qui tam provisions from the False Claims Act, which would put an end to the protections provided to the whistleblowers. Luckily, most of the amendments passed relating to the law have strengthened it rather than weakening the protections. But corporations have other ways to prevent whistleblowers from coming forward. As you'll see shortly, many companies have a way of discouraging people from exposing fraud, and they will make someone's life miserable if they suspect them of reporting anything. And all too often, this intimidation has the capacity to completely ruin a person's career, or it prevents allegations of abuse altogether. Most of the fraud and corruption that has been revealed in recent years has been the result of whistleblower action. The mortgage crisis and Wall Street meltdown brought forward countless people willing to expose the lies and deceit from within the financial industry that helped burn down our economy. Before the economic collapse, it was the Iraq War that gave birth to a new era of corporate corruption. One of the largest government rip-off artists was former Halliburton subsidiary Kellogg Brown Root. KBR had contracts for everything in Iraq, ranging from water purification and delivery to laundry services. And all along the way, they were scamming our troops, our government, and American taxpayers. And that's the main point that everyone needs to remember. When corporations defraud the federal government, they're defrauding the taxpayers. When they lie to the government, they're lying to taxpayers. And when they steal money from the government, they're skimming money off of your paychecks. So let's hear what Pap and Bobby have to say about corporate fraud and whistleblowers. The segment begins with a discussion on a case that was settled last summer between the federal government and pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline. Glaxo had been lying to the federal government for years, and after a whistleblower exposed the fraud in a lawsuit, the company was forced to pay $3 billion for illegally marketing their drugs for off-label uses. Let's take a look.
Pap, I want to talk to you about the Glaxo settlement because this is an area that both you and I have tremendous experience in. It's really an historic settlement for our country.
Well, it's an important settlement, but understand, Glaxo got all the headlines. This is a classic whistleblower case. It got all the headlines, but the Glaxo kind of fraud within the pharmaceutical industry goes on all the time. It's actually interesting to me that Glaxo got so much publicity because there's been huge cases where you've had drug companies do exactly the same thing that Glaxo did here. But I think it's more important to understand really what is a whistleblower case as far how did the Glaxo case come out? It didn't come out because they volunteered it. It came out by two people who I call them patriots because they had enough courage to understand that the conduct by this company was deplorable. What's the history of this?
Well, and the history is really interesting. As you know, and you and I have done a lot of these cases over the years. You're one of the country's experts in these kind of cases. But I think we really need to talk about it because the statute that regulates, that allows whistleblowers, that protects whistleblowers and rewards them for this kind of conduct is now under attack by a Congress that is essentially owned by corrupt corporations. And the history, as you know, Pap, the whistleblower protection statutes have become a foundation stone of American democracy. And If you look at the success of democracies around the world, the biggest enemy of democracy is government corruption. It's when people lose their faith in the government. And that happens, that temptation is always there when you have private corporations dealing with government officials. The whistleblower, the first whistleblower statute, was passed by Abraham Lincoln. It was called the Lincoln Law during the Civil War, and he did it because of corruption among military contractors. At that time, people were selling bad mules to the American government. They were selling shoes that didn't have soles on them. They were selling adulterated foods that would make our soldiers sick. They were selling weapons that were defective and ammunition that just didn't work. That kind of corruption became so pervasive that Lincoln passed a law that said not only is it illegal and we're going to provide for heavy fines, but we're also going to give protection to people who work for those corporations if they come forward and expose to the government that the corporation is stealing from the American taxpayer and stealing from the American people. And Lincoln understood that people who work for these companies are reluctant to do that because of the extraordinary opportunity for retaliation that these companies have
let me point out, even when Lincoln started this in 1863, when Lincoln said, we need a law that empowers the average citizen to come forward and say, and at that point you understand, Lincoln, the law was such that the government could do it, but it had not gone as far as saying the individual can do it. It didn't have that kind of freedom. It's evolved. It's evolved to the point now to where an individual can get a company like Glaxo, for example. They can say what you're doing is. It may not just most whistleblowers don't do this because they get paid a percentage. In the Glaxo case, it was a $3 billion settlement, and obviously the two people who brought that case, they get paid a percentage of it. But if you look at why they really did it, and it's very typical of, I even hate to see these people called whistleblowers. I call them patriots, because sometimes they are the only people standing in between that caliber of corruption that we saw, not just with Glaxo, but we see with drug companies all the time. We see it with the military armaments industry. We see it with oil companies.
With the oil companies, with banks particularly.
Yeah.
Who have all these kind of foreclosure and mortgage scams where they will sell, for example, veterans are under the law. Veterans' mortgages are secured and they're guaranteed and insured by the federal government. So this gives the banks an opportunity to overcharge the veterans for their home, to assess it as much greater value, which makes it much more likely that they're going to foreclose, and then they get the money at the end.
Bobby, let me give you a quick history. I mean, you know this history. You know this case. You've been doing this as long as I have. To me, the most compelling case is, there's several of them, but this one comes to my mind. Had there been a whistleblower, had somebody come forward and said, what you're doing is wrong, had somebody gone to Bayer, let me use Bayer Industries, for example. Company in Berlin, doing business here in the United States. They sell aspirin. That's how they're known, Bayer aspirin. But what about the case where Bayer had a product called Factor 8? They had a product that was made for hemophiliacs. They were children, mostly children who were suffering as hemophiliacs. They said, well, we have a product called Factor 8 which will stop your bleeding when you have a dramatic bleed. It'll stop it. You're going to be okay. What they didn't tell the children, and they didn't tell the parents, is the product that they were getting from the way that they were making it, it was adulterated, and it was actually infected with AIDS virus. Okay? Now, thousands of people died throughout this country. A child would get the AIDS virus from Factor 8. It would spread throughout the household. The mother would die. The father would die. The brothers and sisters would die. Entire families were wiped out. Had there been a whistleblower, then Bayer would not have done the next thing that they did. And it's deplorable. But they stopped. They were told you can't sell it in America anymore. So they took their stock of Factor 8 and they sent it overseas. The same stuff that was killing people in America, they then sent it overseas. Now, thousands of lives were lost. When you talk to most people who are whistleblowers, they don't do this because they know they get 20% of $3 billion. They don't do it for that reason. They do it because in their mind, they understand that if they don't take action, lives will be lost, taxpayers will lose huge amounts of money, and our democracy, if you think about it, is at risk. It's like when Abraham Lincoln, I love you tell the Abraham Lincoln quote, the bankers are in back of me and what was that?
He said, right, in 1863, during the height of the Civil War, Lincoln said, I have the South in front of me and the bankers behind me, and for my nation, I fear the bankers more.
Right.
So he understood the liabilities and the peril of corporate domination of those concentrations of power in a democratic system. And you and I know there are lots of good corporations out there.
Tons of them.
There's lots of them in the healthcare industry that just want to help people. But because of the huge amounts of money that are now involved in this system, there are also people who are willing to steal from the federal government. And the scope of this law has expanded so that it's now no longer limited to military contractors. It's been used against oil companies. It's been used against banks. But probably the largest area of corruption that we're seeing today is consistently coming out of healthcare providers. And again, it's a black eye to the whole industry. It's a black eye to the industry and to the people who are trying to do good things with that industry.
But now it's under attack. Right now you have the lobbyists in Washington that want to stop it.
We need to take a break, but we'll be right back with more on the history of corporate fraud against the government. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Today, we're taking a look at Ring of Fire's expose on corporate whistleblowers and the actions that employers take against those willing to expose corruption. The following video features Ring of Fire hosts Mike Papantonio and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. discussing the issue of fraud against the government, as well as the role that whistleblowers play in keeping corporate America accountable.
Whistleblower statute historically was really the first statute of the progressive movement and the populist movement in our country. It was the first time that government said, wait a second, there's so much corruption and there's so much concentration of wealth that it is actually threatening our democracy.
As a matter of fact,
saw that, but today you have the people who are fighting it on Capitol Hill, which are the usual kind of parade of horrors. You've got the Heritage Foundation, you have the Chamber of Commerce with $50 million that they're putting into these efforts. You have the Cato Institute, you have the Koch brothers, you have all of these very right-wing ideologues that are trying to protect corporate power and to suppress democracy by making sure that if somebody reports corruption by a corporation that they're working for, that person is going to be punished rather than rewarded.
Yeah, so why is it all-out war? Let's state what it is. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't like the whistleblower law. Why would they? Because what they're trying to do is protect corrupt corporations. If you're not a corrupt corporation you don't mind the whistleblower law here in the United States. But the first thing we're seeing right now, because, I mean, if you're an honest company, you don't have anything to hide. It's the corrupt companies that the Chamber of Commerce really is putting a lot of effort to try to protect. Now, where are they going? The first place they're going is to Wall Street. Okay? They're trying to protect Wall Street. Wall Street stole from the American public in one form or fashion around $13 trillion. That's what they stole from mom and pop taxpayers in the last meltdown. So now you have the Chamber of Commerce trying to say, we need to change the Dodd-Frank law, where there is the right in Dodd-Frank for an insider to report corruption. Okay? So it's not completely a whistleblower statute, but it gives a person working inside a bank.
There's a provision in Dodd-Frank that is a whistleblower provision that extends whistleblower protection to Wall Street, essentially.
Right.
And it allows people who are, banks that are defrauding veterans, that are defrauding the American public, that are stealing from the American people, that it allows people who are working for those banks to report their employer and then come in and collect up to a third of the money.
What if you had been the person what if you had been the person that came forward and reported that Barclay and a dozen other companies, a dozen other banks, were controlling interest rates, were gaming the interest rate system all over the globe? What if you had come forward and you said, I'm the person who reports that? First of all, a great thing would have been accomplished because we would have stopped the worst corruption in American history, where the banks have gamed the interest system to where people pay more for their mortgages, people pay more for their home. It across the board affected everybody on the globe, not just in America. That's the first thing. The second most important thing about that is the whistleblower obviously would be rewarded by 20%, 15 to 20% of that recovery. But what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wants to do is make it impossible for that whistleblower to come forward and report it. Here's what they're doing. They're saying before you come forward, you have to extinguish all possibilities of reporting that theft, of reporting that fraud to every part of our company. In other words, you have to call in the hotline and say, my name's Joe Smith, and I want to report something. Well, that doesn't protect...
You have to go to your boss. And your boss may be involved in the corruption.
Exactly.
You have to go to your colleagues. And the Federal Corrupt Practices Act makes it illegal for American firms to bribe foreign officials in order to get an advantage when they go to those countries. In most cases, the people who know about that payment would be only maybe 2 or 3 very, very high-level people. Under the Chamber of Commerce proposition, the guy who wants to report that corruption would first have to go and tell the people who are actually making the payoffs.
Exactly.
So, and it would give a blueprint to that company of how to stifle, to punish, to retaliate, or to discredit that person. They'll say, they'll fire him for drunkenness. They'll fire him for alcoholism. They'll fire him for some dreamed up malfeasance that will be used in the future to say, oh, well, that person was a disgruntled employee. That's the only way to research.
Well, I want to talk about that in the next segment. I want to talk about what they do to whistleblowers. But let me tell you this. I have actually seen cases where you have a corporation and a whistleblower comes forward and the people at the top don't really know what's going on. They really don't. They don't have any idea. Or secondly, they don't think it's wrong. I've actually seen corporations that have said, you know what? This law is so important for democracy that I'm going to go ahead and pay. We messed up. I hate that we messed up. We didn't do it. Somebody down below did it. But it was our corporation. The buck stops with us, and we're going to pay it anyway. That's decency. Most corporations don't play like that. Most corporations do everything they can not to be decent, not to pay when sometimes they think, well, maybe we didn't do anything wrong. We didn't know about it. It really wasn't our fault. But this is an important thing, and we're going to pay it.
let's just, so the audience understands why this is important and how it affects their lives, let's talk about what happens in some of these pharmaceutical cases. You are the leading expert on pharmaceutical litigation in the country. What happened in Glaxo?
Well, Glaxo...
And particularly, why is it important to a taxpayer who may never get sick in their lives?
Yeah. Glaxo is probably the classic example of a whistleblower case that explains everything about why it's important. Here's what happened. You had a company that had completely put profits above decency. Two people working in Glaxo were going to the company and saying what you're doing on many different levels is not just morally wrong, it's illegal. What they were doing, one thing that they would do, Bobby, is they would take one of their drugs and they would sell it to a doctor and they would say, doctor, prescribe this drug for something that it's not supposed to be prescribed for. And they would pay the doctor to actually tell his patients that's a good thing.
And now, that's called an off-label usage.
It's called off-label usage. As a matter of fact, the off-label problem with Glaxo was so bad that they were taking drugs that had not even been approved for use with children, and they were selling the drugs to children. The Glaxo knew that they were doing that. Glaxo knew that the drug had potential to kill the children they were selling to, but they were increasing their profits by increasing their market.
What we know now is that in the pharmaceutical industry, 20% of their profits come from off-label usage.
Yes.
And so there's a huge incentive program with some of these companies to get their sales representatives to do something that's illegal, which is to try to prescribe drugs that may be dangerous for a certain cohort.
Well, let me tell you about what else Glaxo did, though. It wasn't just off-label. They would actually go out and pay doctors. Glaxo would actually write they would write an article for a medical periodical. They would write an article for a magazine. They'd have the doctor sign off on the article as if he wrote it. They would simply make up and say for that doctor whatever they wanted, that scientist, that doctor. I call him a biostitute.
And the article would say this drug, although it is approved and designed for this purpose, is also effective for children.
Exactly.
Even though, and the doctor is not actually breaking the law by prescribing it to a child.
Well, the doctor, well, first of all,
it's illegal for the company to tell the doctor to do that.
Exactly. Let me just tell you something. There is no decent doctor who would or should do that. There's no, but nevertheless, I think they found over 40,000 doctors that were willing to say, yeah, we'll push the limits on, it wasn't just one drug, it was several different drugs. We'll push the limits on prescribing this drug. What are you going to pay me? Now, it didn't end there. When you can go out and you can find a scientist that will sign their name to something, a doctor...
They were paying doctors enormous amounts of money.
Huge, yeah.
Up to $248,000 in one case with Dr. Drew to recommend it on his radio station.
Right.
For an off-label use.
Well, okay,
the temptation for the doctors is huge, too.
So what's wrong with that? What's wrong is the whistleblowers in this case, now understand, these were two courageous individuals who said, I've got to come forward because human life is at risk. I don't like what my company's doing. What they're doing is illegal. They're overcharging Medicare for some of this stuff. Their message to the American public is a lie. We've seen it time and time again. We've seen it with Yaz. We've seen it with Vioxx. We've seen it with... I could go on forever, all the companies that we've seen do this. Now, not all of those times was there a whistleblower involved. Let me tell you what happens to most whistleblowers. Just so it's full disclosure. The reason the people in this case, and in all the cases, they get paid a percentage of what the government collects. In this one, it was $3 billion. So the whistleblower gets a percentage of that.
Well, they can get up to 30%.
Well, they can get, now, as a practical matter, Bobby, it's going to be somewhere between 15 to 20. But the point is this. These whistleblowers are always subject to attack. Matter of fact, most people don't know this. The person who came up with the idea of how to attack whistleblowers was none other than Richard Milhouse Nixon. Nixon came up with a manual in his administration, had a manual,
the Malek manual,
on how we will discourage whistleblowers. And what he did is he said, well, here's some things we should do.
You send them to bureaucratic Siberia, you demote them, you eliminate their jobs, you isolate them. And it was a formula.
It was a how-to
for how to stop people from talking. And that's one of the interesting things that we need to talk about at some point is why is there this kind of sweetheart relationship between government and the corporations with whom they do business, so that the government, because Nixon was actually in that tape, he was trying to protect a military contractor who was stealing from the American people.
Right. Let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you that the whistleblower statute. That's history is incredibly important. Starts out with the Lincoln Law, as you've talked about. But then what happened in 1943? The businesses, the big corporations in America that were dishonest, said this law scares us. So they basically took the teeth out of the law, and the government was ripped off billions and billions of dollars during that time that they took it away. And then in the 1980s, 1986, you had the government found out, well, the armaments industry is billing us $700 for a toilet seat. The drug industry...
Or $500 for a hammer.
Exactly. Or the drug industry was getting away with murder on what they were charging the government. You had the oil industry taking advantage of the government. You had the oil industry, Bobby.
No royalty payments.
They weren't paying royalties. And so all of a sudden...
So they were drilling oil on federal land. They were supposed to pay royalties, but they were ripping off the government.
Exactly. For billions of dollars. And the only people who solved that problem were whistleblowers. It wasn't government that caught it. It wasn't regulators that caught it. These corporations didn't come forward and freely admit that they were stealing from American taxpayers or putting people's lives. How about this? How about where you had a whistleblower? I can't even count the number of American soldiers' lives that were probably saved by a whistleblower coming forward and say, you know what? We're selling these flares. They're combat flares. They shoot them up in the air. What it does is it opens the field to where a soldier can see what's going on. The problem is the damn things were blowing up. Right, and he'd be carrying the flare. It would blow up and kill everybody around him.
If they were dropped more than 10 feet, they would ignite.
They'd ignite.
And they were killing people who were not using them but just carrying them around.
Exactly. So whistleblower, again, came forward and solved that problem. But let me just tell you something. The real trick that we see these corporations use, and Richard Nixon and his people came up with how to discredit a whistleblower. You know what they said? Make the story about the whistleblower, not the conduct about what the corporation has done. In other words, misdirect the discussion. Make the discussion about the guy who's trying to come forward and say something wrong's taking place here. Make the story about him doing something wrong. Make him look like he's greedy because he wants his 20% of the $1 billion. Make him look like he's an incompetent employee. Make him look like he's a bad guy. And in the end, what happens, Bobby, is people are discouraged from doing what could save lives, number one. And secondly, they're discouraged from saving taxpayers billions of dollars. It is no surprise to me that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce will do everything they can to return this law to the 1940s when government was being stolen from the oil industry, from the healthcare industry, from the drug industry, virtually from the armaments industry. Every year we're losing billions of dollars.
Pap, we were talking earlier about the campaign by these right-wing cadre of corporate dominationists on Capitol Hill, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Koch brothers, worst of all, the Chamber of Commerce, to try to undermine whistleblower protection in this country, make it possible, and the methods that the methods whereby they allow the corporation, they put the power to investigate and to control the investigation into the hands of the corporation, which uses these methods that we talked about before. Isolating the whistleblower, making the whistleblower, giving the whistleblower impossible jobs and making it, giving them a record. That undermines their own credibility, making them appear as a disgruntled employee, sending them to bureaucratic Siberia. And also, one of the things I wanted you to talk about is the psychological testing, because that's really nefarious and kind of malevolent.
As you point out, they put so many roadblocks in front of the whistleblower right there within the corporation. You know, it wouldn't surprise me, for every one whistleblower that comes forward, there are 1,000 who are discouraged. And the way they're discouraged is, as you point out, some of the ideas is, you know, to make the issue about the whistleblower, to discredit the whistleblower. But one thing they do is they try to make the whistleblower look like the whistleblower's crazy. One thing they'll do is they'll load the whistleblower up, for example, with a project that's almost impossible. And nobody else could do the project. They'll make it virtually, it's a setup for failure. In the process, they'll bring the whistleblower in. Somebody with human resources will be interviewing the whistleblower. What's going wrong in your life? Why can't you do this? And they'll create a record. And what they're trying to do is create this nefarious record to make it look like the whistleblower is having psychological problems, is really not in touch with reality. I've seen a half a dozen cases like that where inside the corporation they try to make the whistleblower look crazy because they realize that the whistleblower is the only person who can stop them from stealing.
And they actually have outside consulting firms that come in and specialize in doing these investigations and doing psychiatric evaluations of the whistleblower that will make them look like a nut job.
Yeah, one thing they do, this is we've seen this, I know, I've seen it in a couple of cases, where what they do with the whistleblower is they assign what they call a babysitter. Now, the babysitter is somebody who is a corporate toady. That corporate toady will do whatever they're ordered to do. They're a gutless, spineless lapdog. So they will take the spineless lapdog and attach it to the whistleblower, and they'll befriend the whistleblower. The lapdog, the babysitter, will make it look like I'm your pal, and every day what they're doing is reporting on where the whistleblower went. He had drinks here, met a woman here, whatever it is. They try to discredit the whistleblower at every turn. They have professional organizations that come in and do that.
So we know what kind of mechanisms the corporations want that allow them to escape the kind of whistleblower, the attention that they would get from the whistleblower. We know that it works because there's actually a whistleblower provision in the IRS rules, and that provision is never used.
Right.
They're trying to put the same provision today in the SEC rules that would allow Wall Street and all the bankers, et cetera, to escape whistleblower protection laws, and then they want to move on and just get rid of the Federal False Claims Act.
Yeah, and the only time that was done, you and I have handled outrageous cases for decades, Bobby. I mean, you've seen it, and I've seen it. But most people, they only hear the ending of the story. The Glaxo story. Let me just, for example, I have...
Tell us some of the anecdotes.
Some of these cases, I just made a note. The note... It's not just Glaxo. Pfizer, $2.3 billion for kickbacks, for off-labeling. Tenet Healthcare, $1 billion for billing violations, payments to Medicare, kickbacks, bill padding, same kind of conduct. HCA, now this is a really interesting one. The governor of the state of Florida was elected governor after his company, Columbia, had been hit for $1.7 billion for fraud. And then in Florida, they elect him governor. But the point is this. What was he doing? Well, they were
Let me point out that Pap is from Florida.
What were they doing? They were upcoding. They were doing what they would do. They would say, okay, you're coming in for a treatment for a cold. But I'm going to put on our billing that you came in for treatment for pneumonia so they can charge the government more money. They were doing things like setting offices up for doctors where they were paying, that they would tell the doctor, I'm going to give you a loan and you're going to be able to have this loan, but they'd never have the doctor pay it back. They'd pay for furniture, they'd pay for office buildings. So they got hit. Merck got hit for kickback violations, Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud. these cases go on forever. It's not just health care.
It's not health care. It's military contractors like Boeing, like Lockheed, like Alliant. It's the oil industry. It's environmental crimes.
Bobby, here's a case right here. It's New York State versus New York City. New York City was hit for $500 million for overbilling the government for classes that they were conducting, for counseling that they were conducting, for people that had speech impairments and physical impairments, for preschool programs. It's not just corporations. Sometimes you even see businesses that operating like businesses within a municipality, within a state, where they're ripping off the government too. But I mean, AstraZeneca, $500 million false claims where they were using an off-label. They were selling an off-label for a product and giving it to people. It was a psychotic medicine, selling it to people that never should have had it. But the truth is, yes, did the whistleblower get paid a lot of money? Yes, the whistleblower did get paid a lot of money. But how many lives did the whistleblower save? How much fraud from taxpayers paying too much money?
The numbers
was
of this,
saved?
that it's $27 billion that the Justice Department has collected from crooked corporations because of whistleblowers since 1986.
$27 billion,
and that is a tiny fraction of the fraud, the government fraud that's out there.
Bobby,
let me
there's
a lot of Republicans that say, we have to be frightened of big government, we're paying too much in taxes, but we have to be equally frightened of other concentrations of power, the concentration that comes with the influence that some corporations now have, particularly under the Citizens United case, and the kind of sweetheart relationships that develop between government officials and the corporations with whom they're doing business, and that they rip us all off.
Well, here's the best advice I can give, and just to close this, it is this. These people who know something's going on, they can change, they can protect democracy by going forward and reporting it. Now, how that takes place, the reason we've handled so many is because people know we do this. It's kind of a specialized kind of area, granted, but you first of all have to commit yourself to being willing to do it. And you have to understand, I'm not doing this simply because I want to make 20% of $1 billion. Your case may not end up $1 billion, but you have to be committed to the idea that in order for democracy to work, people have to play fair.
Well, and Pap, you talk about democracy, and that's a real connection that people really need to understand. When I grew up, I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and people always wondered how can, at that time there were no democracies in Latin America, and people would wonder, why doesn't democracy work down there? Is there something genetically, or is there something about the climate or whatever? But one of the principal reasons that scholars and analysts understood why it didn't work is that people had lost faith in their government. They didn't believe that the government was there to serve them. They believed that the government was there, that it was a boys' club of people who just dealt with each other, and they were crooked, and there was nothing any citizen could do about it. And, our country has always been the template for democracy around the world. We invented democracy. In 1776, there was no other democracy. It was unheard of. Even by the Civil War, there were only 6 democracies in the world. But people were looking at us. And the more and the longer we last and the better we did it, the more people change. So now there's 120 democracies around the world, and they're all based upon our example. And the key to our resilience as a nation is that we've been able to keep corruption at a minimum, and we've been able to keep citizen participation at a maximum. And both of those things are things that we're losing today and that are under attack on Capitol Hill. And, if we're going to live up to our own ideals as a nation, as the template for democracy, we've got to make sure that our government functions to serve the public and not serve the special interests, and that corruption is kept at a minimum. In order to do that, we need every American citizen to participate. It's a civic duty to go in and report your corporation if they're ripping off the American taxpayer. People are frightened to do that. And what Lincoln was trying to do is to say to the American people, it's okay. It's patriotic. You need to do this, and it's so important that we're going to actually give you an outsized reward for coming out and doing it. And, you know, Lincoln said something else about our country. He said, America is a great nation because we are a good nation. And he said that if we ever lose that goodness that's part of our DNA, that we'll also lose our greatness as well. And it isn't actually part of our DNA. It's part of a system. The reason that America works is not because we're different or better than other human beings around the globe. It's because we've engineered a system that rewards the best in human behavior and the best in human impulses and tries to subdue the darker side of our nature, what Lincoln called the darker angels of our nature. And, you know, we do that through free market capitalism, which is rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior, to make everybody to reward people for doing things that are good for all of us. And these whistleblower statutes are so critical. And the attacks upon them on Capitol Hill are so malevolent because they go right to the heart of our democracy. And that's why it's important for every American to understand that you've got to participate to keep these whistleblower statutes intact. But also, if you're in one of those corporations that's dealing with the American public, that has a sweetheart relationship with some senator or some bureaucrat or some congressman, and you see them doing things that you know are wrong, that you've got to come forward as a moral duty. But not only that, our country, our democracy, is going to reward you for doing it.
You can watch the full video series on corporate corruption featuring Mike Papantonio and Bobby Kennedy on our website at ringoffireradio.com. And that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.